Good morning, and also happy St. Patrick's Day. When I was a kid, and you know how, I don't know if you remember, sometimes on St. Patrick's Day, if you didn't wear green, they would do what? Pinch you, right? And so I always had this thing, and you can't see it now because this room is a little bit, the muted colors, but my eyes are actually have a reflection of green in my eyes. So I always used to say, I don't need to wear green because I have on green every day because my eyes are green. So don't pinch me.
Did it work?
It worked. So today I'm going to talk to you specifically about a study that we did. And most of you are familiar with the IBM Institute for Business Value. And we did a study last year specifically on the relationship of infrastructure to a number of new workloads, cloud, analytics, mobile, and social. And we wanted to understand specifically what role did infrastructure play in how these workloads were going to come to life, what were the needs of clients, and really we just wanted to understand how infrastructure, whether it was relevant or not. Now, obviously, we had a hypothesis that it was important, but we really wanted to understand whether other leaders thought that. The top of the slide, you guys, the top of the slide is missing the rest of the, doesn't have the whole slide on this slide. But long story short, our provocation was, we thought that when we looked at the new workloads that were coming online, that they were going to be needing a different type of base. And did you have a strong enough base in order to really harness the value of the workloads that you were going to be achieving? And we wanted to know, did enterprise leaders believe the same thing? So investing in the right infrastructure really is a foundational step when we think about digital transformation. So it's like building anything. Do you have the right foundation in place to build upon in order to really be prepared for the future? Do you have the right tools and methods required to stay ahead of today's environment? And does infrastructure matter to companies' financial performance? So this was a key question, because if it doesn't matter, then it really doesn't matter what type of foundation you actually have. So what are we seeing? If you think about what's going on in terms of the digital marketplace, and as it accelerates, there's new economies that are emerging. And think about sharing economies like Airbnb and Lyft. Think about new forms of banking like Apple Pay. If any of you were at Interconnect, you would have heard the comment from the Chief Innovation Officer of Citibank, who said, you don't have to be a banker to do banking. So this is fundamentally changing how companies view themselves and how they will compete. Think about Starbucks. Anybody who has the Starbucks app on their phone? If you go to Starbucks enough, you definitely have the Starbucks app on your phone because you want credit for each little $5 coffee that you buy. So after your 12th cup of coffee, you get the free one that you supersize, even though you only get a tall every day. So these new businesses are really forcing traditional firms to rethink how they compete. So how has competition changed? And then how will companies need to optimize their IT infrastructure capabilities in order to be competitive? And we think that it's going to play a really pivotal role in your posture as a firm in order for you to be more competitive. There is something wrong with this, so can you guys fix it? Because I can't read the top lines. Now, I am an author of the study, but I don't have every single word of the presentation memorized. Let me admit that. But let me keep going here. So we did a study, over 750 IT executives, 18 countries and 19 industries. Now, what is significant about this study, yes, it's a lot of people, so it obviously is statistically significant, but more important, when you look at the top 2 groups of people that were in the study out of the 750, it is about 62% CIOs and CTOs. So as it relates to who we were talking to, were they in a position to, essentially be the, markers for their organization? They were. After that, VP of IT infrastructure, VP of application development, VP of data center operations, database administrator, and infrastructure architect. And so you can see the composite, really this, 60%, over 60% of the folks in the survey are the folks either running for their company entirely, all of the IT operations for their company, or the CTOs who essentially are really the visionaries of thinking about what does my footprint for technology look like in the future. And we thought that was critically important. So now they want me to really memorize the whole thing and just kind of just stand up here and talk for an hour without any slides. This is the big story. This is the big story. Yay! Okay. So when we did the study, we discovered that a few things were significant, and we talked about them in this context, in the context of content, meaning what were these leaders really talking about, and how was what they were talking about going to reshape the conversation from a technology perspective. So cloud technology, mobile devices, no surprise, social, and analytics. So, and these things really converge. So even when we talk about here this conversation on analytics, this conversation on big data, you honestly can't have that conversation without talking about mobile. It's very difficult to have that conversation without talking about cloud, because in many ways, those are all integrated. No one just says, I do big data and analytics. That's not how the conversations go. That's not how the conversations go with clients. When we looked at the participants, more and more of those that are in the conversation are non-IT professionals. So many of you are really dealing with business leaders. Those business leaders are making decisions, and in some cases, they're going off because they have their own budgets, and they could just be buying applications because they found something that they like, that's sexy and cool, and they want to bolt it onto your environment, which in some cases, causes some disruption in even the economics of how IT gets done in an organization. So at the end of the day, they're having much more influence on infrastructure decisions and really all IT decisions. And we'll show you some statistics on that. And then the tone is really changing as well. So not only did we do this study, but many of you are familiar with the CEO study, the CIO study. And in the CEO study, for the last 3 years that we've done it, technology is the number one, marker, category, however you want to describe it, that CEOs believe will impact their business. So if you're thinking that technology is becoming less important, it's actually becoming more important, and how you think about technology has changed. The conversation, the participants, and the content has fundamentally changed. So some of the, top findings here. Pretty much, 70% of organizations recognize that infrastructure enables business strategy and drives business results. I'm going to drill down into each of these, but these are really kind of some of our top findings. Over 60% of organizations plan to increase infrastructure investment over the next 12 to 18 months. Probably pretty surprising, less than 10% report that their infrastructure is ready to handle the new workloads that we talked about, cloud, mobile, analytics, social, etc. So I may think it's important, I may want to do it, but is my company ready to do it? Those are two diametrically opposed situations and beliefs at this point. There's certain types of companies that are likely to achieve greater competitive advantage. I'll tell you some of the attributes that they have, and they're also more likely to outperform their peers. And so when we say that, do they believe that it enables competitive advantage? You guys are killing me here. Like, killing me. Seriously, you're killing me. 70%, over 70% believe that it's an enabler to their current and future business strategy and competitive advantage. Now, this is important because to say something like, I believe this enables competitive advantage, you kind of have to drill down into that statement. What does that actually mean? I believe that it helps me optimize revenue and profit. How? And why do you think that? And so we'll drill down a little bit into that. But as I mentioned on the second slide, less than 10% of all organizations believe that they're fully prepared to handle these workloads. And you can see here, increasing popularity of social media and collaboration platforms, 9%, cloud, 7%, proliferation of smart mobile devices, and big data and analytics, it's virtually, it's almost zero. I would say it's probably 0.5%. So there's this notion of I'm prepared, and then there's this notion of I'm fully prepared. So on big data and analytics, for me, I think they're not prepared for what they perceive to be big data and analytics. Everyone is doing data warehousing. People have been doing that for years. People have been doing business intelligence for years. There's nothing new there. But what is new is my ability to ingest data from a variety of sources, my ability to take on large amounts of variable data and somehow be able to ingest them such at a point in time, I'm making the right decision at the right point in time. It's not about just taking in more data. It's not about I just have unstructured and unstructured data and I mix them together and somehow I get an answer. It's really, can I be making the right answer at specific points in time that I'm going to be able to leverage for better decisioning and better decision making inside my organization. We're not ready. We're not ready for that, and most companies aren't. So this lack of infrastructure readiness really shows a few things. 7 out of 10 consumers have had an unsatisfactory service experience in the last 12 months. Literally, I would argue that we probably have one more frequently than that, where you would say, my personal experience was not as good as I would have liked for it to have been. I had one on Friday. For some reason, I used to have a membership, and my fitness membership was bought out by another club, which happens all the time. But they did not notify me that they had purchased my membership, which was okay if in fact I knew now that I had access to about 2,500 clubs as compared to the couple hundred that I previously had access to. So when I called, and the way that I figured this out, on my bank statement, I saw the name of the new club that had purchased the old club, because you know how you have that automatic, that ACH. And so I called and I said, you never notified me that you guys changed this, and I now have access. I should have access to everything because I bought one of those memberships years ago that my husband was getting on my case for, but it was $7 for both of us. And he was totally upset with me that I did this. And I said, this is a lifetime membership, blah, 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 and we'll have access to all these clubs across the country. But everywhere we moved, there was never the club that we had. This is the God's honest truth. And he kept telling me for years, I don't know why we're still paying this money. I said, at some point, it's gonna come in handy, because if you get rid of it now, it's only like, it's less than $100 a year. Why are you complaining? Or whatever it was. I mean, it was like 125 bucks. I said, there's no way your new membership fees are gonna cost so much money. And he said, Jack, we need to get rid of it, but he never did. So when I called on Friday, I said, I call and I said, hey, you guys never told me that you made this change. I don't know how you tried to contact me, blah, blah, blah. So the guy immediately says to me, because a lot of these clubs have been under fire lately, he's like, well, what do you want to do? So he's thinking that I'm trying to get my money back, right? And I said, hey, I don't want my money back. I just want to have access to all these clubs because there's 2,500, and I need you to find my membership number, and figure out what's going on. Well, they had the wrong area code for my old phone number from when I lived in Southern California. So when I gave them 805-526-2952 and tell me why I remember this, because it was 20 years ago, they said to me, well, we have 909. I said, well, that's Montclair. That's not where I live. So that's not the right prefix. Then they had the wrong address for me. They had an address from 2 homes ago. So they had all this information mixed up, but fortunately we got it straightened out. So I would argue that many of us have had those types of customer experiences. About 74% of customers use 3 channels or more for customer service issues. We email, we call on the phone, we might send some snail mail, but at some point we're converging in a way that how are we connecting with people? We may put it on Facebook, we may tweet about it. We're going to let you know that we have a problem. And then we spend a lot of time that's wasted in these contact centers, and the agent can't help us. I spent at least 25 to 30 minutes on the phone with that guy for him to try to figure out who I was, where was my information. But after spending whatever, $10 a month for the last, so many years, I was not getting off the phone until I knew that I had my membership in order and that I was going to be able to go to the club that's like 2 miles from my house. So what are the challenges that companies face? They face challenges with managing their infrastructure primarily around the ability to efficiently, securely move large amounts of data from one place to another. They're always trying to cut costs, so storage becomes increasingly important as it relates to analytics. Security, security, security. We probably can't say enough about the importance of security. You'll also see going down from there, how can we support remote user access of all applications, including bringing your own device? Most companies now allow you to bring your own device. So if you're letting me bring my own device, what implications does it have on not only my ability to take in data, but I also need to know where you are, I need to know how you're using it, and how does that affect my entire ecosystem. And then you can see a number of, ability to store, manage, analyzing, increasing large amounts of data, structured and unstructured data at 7%, because they just can't do that yet. It's not that it's not important. So, IT executives recognize the business already plays a significant role in the IT infrastructure decision-making process. So, related to end-user devices, security, cloud computing. So this involvement of folks who are not IT professionals making decisions is increased. They're going to be making decisions on end-user devices. They're going to be making decisions. As it relates to security, it's more on who gets access to what kinds of information. And when we say cloud computing, this is the notion of companies essentially going out and buying cloud services or brokering the type of services that they believe that they need for their organizations. And so these non-IT decision makers, the belief that IT executives believe that, in 3 years, this is what they're going to be influencing is extraordinary. And what this means is that if you're not in a place of understanding that your non-IT professionals are essentially need to be your business partner, you're going to be probably in a world of hurt in 12 to 24 months, because this tidal wave is coming, and in many cases it's already here. So if we look at, what is the biggest business challenge that these guys face? It's keeping up with the increasing pace of business requirements, period. So as we look at what do I care about, it's business requirements are changing. I, as an IT professional, need to understand what those requirements are, and I need to keep up. The difference now is if you happen to be an IT professional, you are also expected to be a, quote, business professional. So there's no such thing as an IT professional that can get away with, I'm the technical person, but somehow I don't understand what my bank truly does. I don't understand the essence of what my bank's business is. Same for retail, same for consumer, same for industrial. Because the IT professional has to be more of a business partner. And the only way that you can really keep pace with the business requirements is really to understand what the business needs are. Along how do I become more competitive, how do I develop applications that can help the business, those types of things. So if we look at what are the top business drivers for investing specifically in infrastructure, reducing cost, and I say this because as a marketing professional, and I ran segmentation for all of General Electric. In fact, I started their segmentation strategy. Anytime you do any kind of survey for anything, cost, price is always in the top 4. It may be 1, it may be 2, that's almost automatic. So don't get too hung up on, well, really, all people care about is reducing costs. That's table stakes. What they want to do is, obviously, everyone is in an environment of constrained resources. That's the environment we've been in essentially pretty much since about 2006, 2007, of this nature of cutting and cutting and cutting. But having said that, investment's also important. So they're looking at how do they utilize resources more efficiently and more effectively. And if you're going to come in essentially with the highest cost proposition without regard to understanding the total IT ecosystem, that's a non-starter. But they're not looking for you to come in of, hey, I just have the thing that's the cheapest price. That's not what this statement is. The next 3, faster application development and deployment. So how quickly can I develop applications and get them out there to be used by the business to do what? To generate new or enhanced revenue opportunities. And also, the third one here is more effective disaster recovery. So if in fact I were to encounter a problem, am I prepared to handle it? So a couple of examples that I want to bring out. Specifically, you guys may have seen, we talk about Red Bull fairly frequently. So Red Bull Racing has won the last 4 drivers' championship cups over the last 4 years. They really tout the reason that they're able to do this is really based on a lot of work that they're doing, I would argue, which is really more HPC oriented, but they're able to maximize their car design changes in a regulated environment. So those of you familiar with Formula 1 racing know that you can change your car pretty much after every single race, but you have an allotted time for testing and an allotted time for design changes, etc., which means that your expediency with your ability to make those changes becomes critically important. So they need to accelerate the speed of simulations using real-time analytics. And it's really, they have this, they had an expansive and underused IT infrastructure, and so what they really wanted to do was put themselves in a position where they were obviously making better use of their capacity, but they needed to have better efficiency, so they did increase their efficiency by 20 to 30%. They've gone on record themselves saying, hey, this has contributed to our championships. Another example, JP Morgan Chase. 23 million transactions per day, totaling 7.5 billion in terms of the cash that they manage for other banks around the world. They noted that they had too many operational silos. They couldn't do fast sharing of information. They also had a lack of integration. They launched a dashboard to provide a single client data view. This was primarily focused on client experience and their ability to provide all of their member banks a better experience, consolidate their infrastructure into one data center, and they have a follow the sun approach. And I mean, all of this information is Googleable as well. These guys are what we call strategic IT connectors. So they were folks who invested in IT infrastructure. There were several best practices that led to better business results. Now, we didn't know this at the time. We, wanted people to self-identify on these 5 key areas. Do you have a well-defined infrastructure strategy? Do you collaborate with the business to provide infrastructure solutions? Do you support cross-functional infrastructure domain expertise? Do you collect and analyze data and document performance metrics? And are you a broker of IT services? In order to get labeled a strategic IT connector, you did not have to do all 5 of these. You only needed to do 3. Okay? So if you did any of these 3 in no particular order, we identified you as a strategic IT connector. That was only 17% of the 750. So only 17% of the 750 companies that we studied had 3 of the 5 of these characteristics that would enable you to be in the bucket that we're going to call a strategic IT connector. And in a couple slides, you'll see why this is really, really important. The lower tail, the 20%, are people that really had none of these. They had none of these. They didn't, I can't believe that you wouldn't have someone doing something of any of these in your company, but 1/5 of the guys did not. So what did this mean? If you were a strategic IT connector, you were more likely to outperform your peers, particularly the siloed operators, revenue and growth, 200% more likely to outperform. So if you did 3 of the 5 characteristics, or you exhibit 3 of the 5 characteristics that I just talked about, 200% more likely to be an outperformer as it relates to revenue and growth. From a profit perspective, 80% more likely to outperform your peers there. And net profit margin, you're 138% likely to outperform your peers just by doing 3 of those 5 things consistently. Strategic IT connectors also allocated a greater percentage of their IT budget to infrastructure. Now, this is fascinating. So what are you doing today versus what are you going to do in the next 3 years? If you look at what the siloed operators are doing today, 5% in the next 3 years, they're going to raise that up to 22% in terms of they recognize that they need to do something. They need to keep up with the new workloads, the requirements of the new workloads, so they know they have to mission themselves forward. But in many ways, don't you think it's a little late? Because as they're doing that, they're only getting to the place where the strategic IT connectors are today. So in 3 years, these guys are going to be at 22%. These guys are now going to be investing about 40% of their total dollars in infrastructure to really put themselves in a position to win, because it is about foundation. Do you have the right foundational elements in place to ensure that you're going to be successful in the future? They also invested for competitive advantage. So what does that mean? If you look at the ranking for business drivers for upgrading and investing in infrastructure, achieving competitive advantage, again, remember I said cost was table stakes. So there's virtually no difference between how a strategic IT connector thinks about cost and expense, because everyone knows that this is a paradigm that everyone's in. I get past that, now where am I? These guys are investing to achieve greater competitive differentiation. Think back to Red Bull. Think back to JP Morgan. There's no debating how they relate and rank against their peers. So achieving competitive advantage, tied for number 1. And for the siloed IT operator, greater competitive advantage is last. I mean, I actually think that's amazing that you don't think that you're going to use anything to have greater competitive advantage. Twice as many strategic IT connectors view infrastructure as an enabler. So you recall, I showed you that very first slide, in the very first slide where I said 70%, so 7 out of 10 believe that it was an enabler to competitive advantage, etc. That was of the total population of 750. When you distill that down between those who are strategic IT connectors and those who are siloed operators, you'll see that twice as many of the strategic IT connectors believe that it's an enabler to future business strategy and competitive advantage. So this notion of how do I pool my resources together specifically for the workloads that I am not prepared for. Because you'll remember on slide number 3, I said 10% of companies are not prepared for the workloads that they need of the future. Those workloads are around cloud analytics and mobility, and you'll recall that they were somewhat prepared for analytics, but virtually not prepared at all from a fully prepared perspective. So what is it in terms of skills? What kinds of skills do these organizations need, and how do they think about skills and business knowledge? And one of the things that we saw that was critically different between siloed IT operators and the strategic IT connectors were the following: that for strategic IT connectors, and remember when I said knowing and understanding your business. So if you are the CIO, you're almost at the same time, you don't have to necessarily be the chief risk officer, but you do need to understand banking. And if you are the retailer, if you're federated, you do have to understand really the paradigms that go on within a real retail environment. You can't just be necessarily the technology person in that environment. That doesn't work as well, quote, anymore. Number 2, this ability to have more cross-domain knowledge. So as people have become more siloed and specialized over time, there is this broader need for people to actually have a broader understanding so that they can be more collaborative inside the complete organization and the complete ecosystem of IT. Not just the server specialist, not just, the storage person as well. How are they using analytics? Do you have analytic skills? Do you understand how analytics can be used in an organization to improve your competitive advantage and competitive posture? And how, as an IT professional, do you help your organization become more prepared from an analytics point of view? Are you ready to do that, and do you have the skill set to do it? And this is very different than saying, hey, I'm a data scientist and I do analytics. This is not that statement. It's, do you understand the necessary requirements to help your company have a strategy around big data and analytics, and then how do you employ that strategy to better prepare your company to take advantage of the opportunities that will enable competitive advantage. So how do strategic IT connectors look in terms of their overall preparedness compared to the group that we said was on the other end of that tail from that really what just looks like a normal distribution? So they're 420% more prepared for cloud, you know, not as even well prepared, quite frankly, for analytics, just slightly better prepared. So there's still this lag here of being fully prepared. This is a big data and analytics statement. And as Alex said earlier, it's not so much the hype, there's been a lot of promises made about what people can do, and they're just not able to do it yet. And they're not able to do it yet because they're foundationally not equipped to do most of what is needed in this particular area. But as you can see, in every case, those who exhibit or have the qualities of the strategic IT connectors, they are more prepared for all of the workloads that you will need to be successful really over the next 24 to 36 months. So, but even with all that said, so even if I take all of that into consideration and I just look at the absolute number of companies that put themselves in, and remember I said you only had to have 3 of these, which is why you don't see higher numbers for each of them, because you only had to select 3. Only about 1/5 of these organizations have a well-defined strategy. So if you're thinking about big data and analytics, what's your overall strategy? Do you have one? And how does that strategy relate to your overall business strategy? I would say that that's core in terms of this conversation that we're having over the last couple days on BD&A. Collaborating with the business to provide, infrastructure solutions. Hire, can you turn that off? Can you turn that off? I cannot make this up. I cannot make this up. Honestly, I can't. Only about 30% are collaborating with the business to provide infrastructure solutions. At least there were no swear words in that same time. I'll say that much. We get pretty racy sometimes. Yeah, we get pretty racy. About 34%, IT is a broker of technology services. So about 1/3 of these guys believe that their orientation and their role is to provide technology services for their organization. This supporting cross-functional teams, is fairly encouraging, because at least 4 out of 10 of them are doing that, where you're actually having cross-functional teams that have cross-functional domain expertise. We thought that was important. But again, when we look at these 2, well-defined strategy, and you collect data and understand what's going on in your organization, just much, much smaller, just not enough there. And which then says, in many cases, quote, we're not ready. So if we kind of cull this down and coalesce, how do we become more important? You know, how do you become a strategic IT connector? What are the things that you need to do? The first thing in terms of, you know, how we thought about this was really, do you have a customer activated agenda? If you have a customer activated agenda, it automatically forces you to think about what type of analytics you will need in order to provide, you know, a better client experience. A better client experience, by its very nature, will position you better against your peers competitively. So that's what, you know, think Starbucks in that term, think any of the major banks who've really taken this on, I would say, full force. They recognize that they were not competitive. There's pretty much no major bank that doesn't have really this multi-channel way of connecting, of allowing you to do business anytime, any place, anywhere, wherever you are. So I would argue that really the banking industry is really the leaders here, particularly as it relates to what do I need to do for my customers to keep my customers, because they're not going to necessarily be going into a branch. How are you? Remember, security was the third thing in terms of importance of what people were thinking about when they talked about how do they become more prepared. So really investing for, you know, and planning for the unusual, things that you don't know are going to happen, but you need to really be incorporating more predictive analytics, more role-based information, particularly around security tools to protect your infrastructure. If you're not doing cloud, this is not a cloud conversation, but I would argue if you're not engaged in cloud, I'm not sure what your company or organization would be thinking about. It is the game changer as it relates to using resources more efficiently. And as I mentioned earlier, this notion of there's really, when we look at, anytime we've done any of these, you know, cross sections, there's no one just doing cloud. Cloud doesn't just happen somehow in the ether where people are sitting around and going, I'm creating a cloud environment. They're creating a cloud environment to either run a hybrid environment that's really going to run some SaaS applications or things like that. You're going to need to do analytics. You're going to need to do mobility. The only way to really do that efficiently without spending a lot more money than you're already spending is really to think about how you can optimize your ecosystem for cloud. Repositioning the role of IT as a trusted advisor. This is critical. So when we think about IT, going back to the business of IT and how you think about yourselves and your profession, it's not just I'm the IT person. I'm the business person who really is a technologist. And how do I work and collaborate across my entire organization, whether it's the division head, whether it's other people in the C-suite that need to understand how our technology helps them do their job better. But that's my role now as the IT leader. And those companies that are doing this well, I think, are going to be more successful overall as well, because it's not this, you know, kind of CIO guy and then everyone else, these technology people and then everyone else in the company. It's this really well integrated opportunity for these guys to be advisors on how to help the business be better and how to help the business be more successful. And then the last thing here is, when you think about who's in IT today and how have those people changed, one would argue that our profession as IT professionals is changed, has changed, is changing. It's never going to go back to what it was. It's become much more business oriented. But what kind of resources do you need today for the future? Even as we think about marketing and the kind of resources that we need in our organization to transform our business for the future, that's changed. So if you don't have strong content expertise, you're not going to be as successful in this profession as maybe you could have been 3 or 4 years ago without those expertise. It just is where we are. So all professions evolve over time, but when we think about this notion of having business knowledge and how the IT professional can help usher or guide the business forward and make them more competitive, that's what we're saying when you have to re-examine your human supply chain. So these are 2 specific reports that we released last year. There's a lot more very specific information. Probably when you read it, I guarantee that the screen won't go down, that you'll be able to read the top of the page, and what else is going to happen. And in the middle of it, you won't have messages pop up and start talking to you. So I promise you that none of those things will happen when you read the report. But I do encourage you to read the report because there's a lot more specificity, and we drill down. Each of those reports is probably about 20 to 30 pages, and I could never cover that in the lot of time that I have today. So I appreciate your patience, and just thank you for being such a gracious audience when we had so many issues. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Any questions for Jacqueline? Yes.
What was the vertical industry breakdown, especially among your strategic connectors versus others?
The difference among the strategic connectors on the industry perspective didn't really change that much. So I'll go back to the industry page, but the industry breakdown there was really no difference in the industry in terms of the strategic connectors versus the other guys. So do I have the industries here? I don't have them here, but it's in the report, and I can get that to you. But there was no definitive. If you were banking, you had more strategic IT connectors than others. That wasn't true. It was just kind of across the board. So think every industry: banking, retail, chemical, petroleum, et cetera, et cetera. There was really no definitive. We actually did take a look at that to see if there were some industry markers that said, in this industry, people are a little bit more prepared, et cetera. There wasn't enough there to make that call.
Yes, 1 second. Excuse me.
I found it intriguing that on one of the strategic IT connector slides that enhancing customer service was at the very bottom of the strategic perspective. So any comments there? Right there, improved service levels.
That's IT service levels.
IT service levels, okay.
Yeah, IT service levels, not customer service to your external customer. Yeah. They don't care about any of you guys inside the company. They don't care about the outside company.
Any other questions? Yes.
So you may have already answered this, but forgive me if you did. So you were pointing out how these companies that have at least 3 of these 5 strategic connectors in place are the ones that are outperforming by so many 80, 200%. How confident are you that it's not the causal arrow in the opposite direction, that because they are already outperforming, they have the money, the finance, the resources, the people to invest in 3 of the 5 things? So in other words, they did the investment. Well, but
I think in order for them to be prepared to do some of the things that they're doing, they obviously need to, in many ways, have been doing a lot of other things right. This isn't the only thing that they're doing right. It's one of the things that they're doing right. So I would argue that over time, they've had the ability to essentially, they could have more budget. And I think that what I see with clients over time is that those clients, honestly, that have a propensity, for lack of a better term, to even invest in bad times. Can you just take that off the screen because it's going to keep popping up because it's my same time. They have a propensity over time to really do more around innovation. So I would argue that there are some companies, based on the nature of the company and the climate in the organization, that even when times get a little tough, they're still willing to invest. And when they invest, they're investing for the future. Whereas some companies, kind of clamp down when times are bad, and you can only kind of keep cutting and pruning. It doesn't usually turn into better, investment later on, generally speaking. So I would argue that's really the case.
You mentioned the importance of enterprise utilization of cloud technologies.
Mm-hmm.
In your research, did you have any distinction between a hybrid internal cloud strategy, or were you talking more about utilizing external cloud service providers?
We did. The slides that said delete this slide or add that slide, I took those out last night. No. No, seriously, I did take them out last night because this is more big data and analytics. But from a cloud perspective, what we looked at was, did people understand their current cloud strategy? What were they going to be investing in the future? And did they know what they were going to invest in? And I did remove the slide, but if you go to the study and read it, what you'll see is about half of these companies, of the 750 executives, really don't know. They don't know what they're going to do over the next 18 months on cloud, whether it relates to private or hybrid. And we specifically asked about both to understand. And only of the population that we surveyed, only 80% of them knew currently, had a good, feeling and understanding what their cloud strategy even was today at this very moment. Larger companies, those companies over $10 billion, they obviously had, knew more, because just think about it, they've got more resources, and they're going to be ahead of the curve on that. But in many ways, again, on cloud, surprisingly, just not there yet, even though it's talked about all the time as if everyone's already arrived. And that's what I think is interesting. We talk about cloud as if everyone is already doing cloud. We talk about big data and analytics as everyone's already doing that too. And the numbers just prove themselves out. It's something that maybe people want to move to, but they're not there today.
Hi, just a quick question on, did you go deeper to find out the business units that were driving some of this innovation? Our own experience is in marketing, sales, and customer service, and are you seeing that through these surveys or not?
Say that one more time. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
What are the business units that are driving the IT differentiation going on?
I mean, a couple things. It wasn't in the study, but we've also done a CMO study just to understand what are CMOs doing. And I would argue there's a few things. If you really think about how people are trying to transform a client experience, or what do they think they can do to be more competitive, I think that's driving a lot of the behaviors that you see. As soon as, companies feel somewhat disintermediated. So think about Uber, think about Lyft, think about Airbnb. I mean, who would have thought that, these companies would be where they are? But they are where they are because they have a disruptive business model. So, and that disruptive business model is predicated on the experience and expectation that we as consumers have, and how those expectations have changed. So what I would argue is that some of your more traditional companies are trying to really understand how they can compete. The only way that they can compete is really, better data points, and to be able to create more personalized services for their own constituents. And they just haven't done that. If you think about marketing of the past, and this really boils down to marketing, it's mass marketing. Even if you're an investment bank, It's still mass marketing. I'm just kind of putting out information kind of to try to make sure that I hit the broadest set of constituents. That's not how people buy anymore. Even if it's not as personalized as we want it to be or we think it is, we have an expectation that we're going to get more personalized service, more personalized, a more intimate experience. That's just our expectation. So some of these things that are cropping up that are disruptors, you'll see that it's what I need when I need it, period. That's what Uber is. That's what Lyft is. That's, even I would argue that's what Apple Pay is doing. It's convenience, meeting my specific needs right now.
When you market to a company like JP Morgan, some of these big financial companies, other companies, do you have a template that you use to say, here's what IBM can help you do for a strategy on investment into IT infrastructure and applications? This is what's going to happen in the next 5 years. Here are your requirements.
We do. We do that with almost every company, right? So we do have assessments. Any of these companies are huge, whether it's, someone like a Wells Fargo, someone like a JP, someone like a Citi, those are just huge companies. Their IT departments are large and looming. So it's not just, there are strategies that I would argue at different layers of the organization. But everyone that we talk to, we talk about services related to assessments that can be done to kind of see where people are now and where they're trying to go, and then how do they get there, and then what would we suggest in terms of, how to make that happen.
Okay, and are you looking at, besides just servicing large commercial companies and other agencies, but social services? People wanting that more intimate experience, can you come up with applications? Are you getting down to that level?
Yeah, we have a whole developer network as well, I would argue, from the software side that encourages that type of development. So it's not just large firms that IBM deals with. I would say that it runs a spectrum. And I would also make the argument that over pretty much I would say the last 3 to 4 years, there's been a big push on the development side. There's been a big push as well on open ecosystems. So it's not just us developing everything, it's providing environments where you can have open innovation, because we believe that that is an accelerator to innovation as well.
We have 2 more questions.
Jackie, you mentioned in your presentation something which I took with a lot of attention. You mentioned security.
I'm afraid now.
Security.
Yes.
Security. All the companies, small to medium business and high enterprises, they do have periodic, continuous vulnerability assessments and all of these audits to check that everything is in place if something might happen. And how do you explain that banks, and you know which ones we are talking about, maybe more than I, companies like Home Depot, companies like, you name it, all of those companies hack, even technology companies. Somebody hacked the other time, Symantec, hack all these companies. So what do you think is going with security when a customer tells you, yes, we have everything covered. We have the best intrusion detection system. We have the best encryption in motion with 256 AIS full-blown encryption, in motion. So, and then they get hacked and they get on their knees.
I think
are we going to talk about 256 encryption times 2, 521 bits of encryption maybe? That's what we need to do now?
Well, I think particularly on security. Most people will tell you that the biggest threat on security are insiders. They're not people outside your organization. And I think probably the biggest proof point on that is the United States government, because even with all of the barriers and things that you put up to encrypt, when people do have access to your information, because you've got to give access to somebody in order for the things to get done, that you are still vulnerable because of people inside the organization. So I would say that's the first thing, and that really is the biggest threat. So there, a lot more work needs to be done, I think, on ensuring that you have you have mechanisms in place that that at least alert you sooner, which is what most of the retail firms didn't have. They might have found something, but the quickness with which they found it obviously wasn't good enough. I would also argue, even last week I was with a client, I was with a healthcare service provider last week in Chicago, and they were talking about they were teasing each other about changing a password, and apparently there's something that had to be changed every 30 days. But they even said that someone had accidentally downloaded a file. Now, this was in a test environment, that this is healthcare information. Nothing happened to it. They got an alert, but in some ways, there should have been an alert that happened before the person was able to download the information. Now, they were downloading it to a test environment, and there wasn't anything suspicious, or they weren't trying to do anything bad, but they even said, now this is a company that I would argue has some of the highest security out there, because we're talking about healthcare records, and they made that statement. So I would argue that a lot of times you don't know what you don't know until something happens where you say, uh-oh, now that this happened, I probably should put something in place that alerts me, or there is some kind of permission to say I'm downloading this information for this purpose to be put in a test environment, and someone has to sign off on that. But that didn't happen. What they knew was the information had been downloaded, and then after it was already downloaded, then they went and found out that it was a test environment. But what if the person was a malicious employee? Then you would have heard about it, as would we all have. And so I would argue that, they're probably, there's not everything can necessarily, to the best of, companies' abilities. I know that everyone in this space is doing whatever they can, but I still believe that some of this is kind of like old-fashioned police work. You have to understand who's working for you and what their motivations are, because in many cases it may be someone who is working with you that could be the perpetrator of those activities. I'll take one last question.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. You mentioned that in your study regarding IT innovations and IT connectors, there was no some kind of distinguished business, which means like retail sale and banking, they are pretty much on the same level. How come it didn't come up that some companies, like for example, investment banking, which doing high frequency trading, where the 1 millisecond cost you per year like $100 million, and IT innovations, it's nature of their business, versus like retail sale like Home Depot, where the IT functions are pretty much back office, or they are like website sale. How come it was not reflected? Thank you.
Yeah, it really, there wasn't, I couldn't tell you. I could tell you how many banks that are in the study. We don't know which banks are in the study specifically, because remember, these are anonymous surveys. But I would tell you that there wasn't enough of a difference between someone who was a strategic IT connector in a bank versus someone who was a strategic IT connector in retail. There just wasn't enough of a difference. The question was, as a strategic IT connector, did you have 3 of the 5 characteristics that would put you in that classification? Now, theoretically, and just based on the numbers, you could see that there, was virtually no one that had all 5 of those, considering that the percentages were like 22% or 24%, and the highest was 39%, of any one of those characteristics. So there just wasn't enough distinction between if you were in one industry versus another. Just wasn't there. And we did cut the data that way to see if there was something, were there certain industries that had a greater propensity. And I would just tell you that in general, because we all experience retail and because we all experience banking, there's a certain expectation that we have. It's also much more touchable. It's much more sticky as compared to a B2B business that, is a petroleum business. They're still doing an awful lot of analytics. If you're doing enhanced oil recovery in the Middle East, you're doing a lot more statistics than the high frequency trader is, to be perfectly honest with you. I knew that's because I worked at GE. So if you're trying to find oil in a place where there's no oil, there is an awful lot of analysis that goes into that. And so, or even in mining. So businesses that you don't think there's a lot of analytics and statistics, there is. We're just less familiar. And in the case of mining, it's honestly life and death. And I can tell you that for a fact. So the wrong decisions and the wrong calculations are made can be the difference between someone living and dying. So again, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. It's nice being down in Florida.